So the final panel of this conference is an interesting one for two reasons. First of all, for the topic, it's the public health approach in the gambling industry. And secondly, we have an expert moderator and two expert speakers, and both speakers will be joining us remotely again. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Constantinos Stylianou, the Executive Director of the NNAC. The stage is yours, and we're keen to see what we can learn from you. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. It seems that I'm the only one here because our fellow panelists are online. So I think it will be a bit awkward if I sat down there. So I prefer standing here. Hello and welcome. The issue we have now to discuss, I think that it signifies the shift, the change that is also explained by the chairman of the National Betting Authority in the morning. The shift from responsible gaming, responsible gambling to safer gambling, and at its core, this shift focuses on public health. And I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Mark Griffiths. He's the Director of International Gaming Research Unit in the Psychology Department of Nottingham, Trent Universities. And also with us is Dr. Eric Louderback, right? Research and Evaluation Scientist, the Cambridge Health Alliance, and instructor in the Harvard Medical School. So welcome to both of you, and I will give the floor to Dr. Griffiths to begin with.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. We've been told we've only got 5 minutes to talk about things, so I was going to briefly look at gambling disorder as a public health issue here in the UK. And anyone that's been following my work for the last 35 years will know that I've been a strong advocate of seeing gambling disorder very much on the health agenda, not just here in the UK, but worldwide more generally. If you go back to my publications in the early 1990s, particularly when I was concentrating on slot machine gambling here in the UK, I often mentioned, if you like, some of the health consequences that were faced by gamblers, particularly those who I perceived to be addicted to slot machines here in the UK. But it wasn't actually until 2001 that I wrote an editorial in the Journal of Health Psychology, and that was the first time that I kind of crystallized my thinking about why gambling disorder, or well, then it wasn't called gambling disorder, we would call it problem gambling or gambling addiction. But in that particular editorial, I said that problem gambling may be perceived as a kind of grey area within the field of health compared to other types of addiction, and that general practitioners, they routinely ask patients about their cigarette smoking, about their alcohol drinking, but they rarely, if ever, ask patients or their clientele about gambling. I mean, it's just not something that's really talked about. And in this editorial, I also said if the main aim of general practitioners is to actually ensure the health of their clients, then it's quite clear that an awareness of gambling and problem gambling and gambling addiction and the issues surrounding it should be an important part of their basic knowledge. And one of the things that I said, and this is a quote from my editorial, I said that problem gambling is very much a health issue and that it needs to be taken seriously by all of those within the health profession, including health psychologists. Then a few years later, in 2004, I wrote an editorial in the British Medical Journal. And again, in that particular editorial, I argued that gambling hasn't traditionally been seen as a public health issue. And also in that editorial, I talked about some of the health consequences for people who are addicted to gambling. And I talked about things like gambling addicts experiencing depression, experiencing anxiety, insomnia, various intestinal disorders, migraines, stress-related disorders, and suicidal ideation. And some people might say that gambling is self-inflicted. I mean, we know that people who are gambling addicts, have gambling disorder, can be very highly stressed. And as a result of that stress, they can experience stress-related disorders resulting in various health consequences. And it's been leveled at me sometimes is that, those kinds of people is that, why should they get treatment when it's self-inflicted? Well, I would argue, we treat smokers who drink nicotine, smokers who smoke nicotine, alcohol drinkers who drink alcohol. If you go on a skiing holiday and you go skiing and you break your leg, we wouldn't say it's self-inflicted, we're not going to treat you. So for me, gambling is something that should be treated within within a health service. I also mentioned that editorial that even things like, people undergoing withdrawal from gambling, there are health effects that come from that, including breathing difficulties, headaches, the chills, muscle aches, heart palpitations, and loss of appetite. And in that editorial, and I quote again here, I said that gambling is without doubt a health issue, and there is an urgent need exists to increase awareness in the medical and health professions about gambling-related problems and to develop effective strategies to prevent and treat problem gambling. Then in 2007, I was invited by the British Medical Association here in the UK to actually, if you like, write their position statement and have a look at gambling addiction and its treatment within our national health system. And what I said in that then, it was a very long document. It was almost like a mini book, to be honest, but I made lots of different recommendations. And some of the recommendations I made were, one, is that treatment for problem gambling should be provided in the UK national health system, either as a standalone service or actually alongside other drug and alcohol addiction services. And I also said that it should be funded by gambling-derived revenue. I also made a recommendation that healthcare professionals should receive education and training, and within that, within their general practitioner's training, in the diagnosis and appropriate referral for effective treatment of gambling problems. I also recommended that healthcare professionals should understand the importance of screening their patients, and it should be perceived to be that this should be for those who are at increased risk of gambling addiction. And I also recommended the provision of a nationally dedicated problem gambling treatment, advice and counselling service, both in and outside of our UK NHS system. And then in 2011, I did, and I think this is still the only kind of audit that's been done on gambling treatment within our national health system here in the UK, is that using the Freedom of Information Act, myself and Jane Rigby, we sent out 327 letters to every single primary care trust and foundation trust and mental health trust in the UK requesting information about problem gambling service provision. What we found, probably unsurprisingly, was that 97% of the trust didn't provide any service whatsoever for the treatment of gambling disorder, gambling addiction, problem gambling, whatever you'd like to call it, for treating those with gambling problems. And in fact, only 9 trusts out of those 327 that we contacted said they actually dealt and tried to treat problem gamblers at all. And only 1 trust actually offered dedicated specialist help for problem gambling, and that actually was indirectly funded by the gambling industry through donations from what was then the Responsibility in Gambling Trust and is now called Gamble Aware in the UK. And there was also some evidence that problem gamblers may actually get treatment via the NHS system if that person had another comorbid disorder, for instance, depression or alcohol problems, etc. And just this weekend, I went on, and this is the final slide I'll put on today, is I want to see what the current situation in the UK is for National Health Service treatment for gambling disorder. If you log on to their website, what they actually say is that people who have gambling problems can go to the charity GamCare. GamCare is actually a charity that I co-founded back in 1997. It runs the telephone national helpline in the UK. You can approach the National Problem Gambling Clinic in London, which is, was one of the first to open up its services for treating gamblers. You can go to, there is now a new service that's now in Leeds called the NHS Northern Gambling Service. So there are actually 2 clinics that are now operating in the NHS in the UK. They also advise people to go to Gordon Moody Association, which actually has 2 residential treatment facilities, one in Dudley in the middle of England and one down in Beckenham and Kent in the southeast of England. Also, it says that you can obviously contact Gamblers Anonymous, and there are over 200 GA groups in the UK. And there was no mention of private treatment on that website, but we do know there are a number of addiction clinics that do treat gambling as well. So I'll leave it to say thank you much for listening and hand it over to Eric, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
So thank you very much, Mark. Eric, you have the floor.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Let me just share my slides here. And then, let's see. How's that? Can
Okay,
everyone see my screen? Yeah. Okay, great. Alrighty. So let me just follow up from Mark's talk here. I'm going to talk about public health approaches to reducing gambling-related harm, and I'm going to be covering sort of the multiple stakeholder perspective. So thinking about operators, thinking about individual gamblers, thinking about researchers and regulators, and kind of how all of these stakeholders play an important role in reducing gambling-related harm. And I'm coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts in the USA. So quite a ways away. Thank you for having me. So just a quick introduction. As we all know, gambling is a common form of entertainment, recreation. It's legally sanctioned in most countries across the world. Most people who gamble actually don't develop problems, but a small percentage, anywhere from 1% to 3%, I've also seen higher estimates around 5 or 6% of people do fit criteria for gambling disorder. And public health approaches really use two mechanisms to try to reduce gambling-related harm. The first is prevention. So this is systems that are in place to reduce the potential for people to move from simply gambling recreationally onto gambling at risk or problem-related ways. And then treatment, which includes access to clinical resources and providers to help reduce problem gambling in people who are experiencing gambling-related harm. And Mark sort of finished up, I think, with a great list from the UK of treatment providers for people experiencing gambling-related harm. So today I'm just going to talk about the potential for gambling-related harm, how public health frameworks apply to gambling, and then what the role of multiple stakeholders are in harm reduction. So just a quick definition. So some researchers down in Australia, including Brown, developed this great graphic here, which kind of breaks down the dimensions of gambling-related harm. So, we have what most people think of, which would be financial harm, and that could include things like debt or bankruptcy, and then a whole variety of other types of harms. I don't really have time to go into each one, but as you can see here on the screen, these are the different dimensions of harm. And they can range all the way from relationship problems to things like potential criminal activity. So if we think about prevention from a public health standpoint, the purpose and sort of way prevention works depends on where you are on the spectrum of gambling behaviors, right? So Schaefer and colleagues back in 2004 developed this really nice graphic, and this is really the spectrum of gambling behaviors. So moving from no gambling at all to healthy gambling, and all the way to unhealthy gambling. And if you think about kind of each phase in this spectrum, right, you have different types of prevention programs that might be effective. So, I've sat in on a few of the sessions at this conference. Everything's been really interesting. And I saw that one thing discussed has been safer play advertising, right? So to sort of counter a lot of the advertising that's on TV and other things like smartphones that just talks about gambling, as entertainment, you also have safer play advertising, which might be, encouraging people to gamble within limits or more responsibly. Secondary prevention is for people who are already gambling, and this might be in-game safer play features. So this could include things like limit setting features in-game, or maybe even like pop-up messages that remind people to gamble within their own personal limits. And then tertiary prevention, this is going to be, for people who already have developed problems. And like Mark mentioned, this might include something like a gambling helpline, or having treatment available for people experiencing problems. Treatment, so once people do develop problems with gambling or even gambling disorder, there are certain treatment approaches that can be used. So this might include like motivational interviewing. Very common would be cognitive behavioral therapy, which is what most people think about when they think about psychotherapy. Medication for some folks, and then also tools such as self-exclusion or self-limiting features. And just really quickly before I get to the last slide, which is coming up. When you think about a therapy for something like gambling disorder, it would really be focused on developing coping skills. So, helping people to realize their gambling and maybe stop some of these urges to gamble if they don't want to. Another one would be sort of, helping people to challenge maybe some of these unhealthy thoughts about gambling that might preoccupy them. So, those are kind of some ideas for treatment. And then, just some key takeaways. So there's really a lot of benefits that come with a public health approach to preventing and treating gambling harm. Can help reduce problem gambling, of course, help people who are actually suffering with gambling disorder, enhance coordination among stakeholders, and like I said, that would include regulators, operators, researchers, treatment providers, give people tools to gamble more responsibly, and then also better understand the risk factors for problem gambling. It's really important to consider all stakeholders. I know this is a multi-stakeholder conference, and I'm excited for the Q&A coming up after. And, again, it really, I think, goes a long way to think about everyone who's involved in the process. And, research has shown that when people gamble, they do consider, stakeholders as having sort of a shared responsibility for ensuring safer play. So that's an important thing. And then, lastly, just really thinking about research-wise, I don't think gambling research should be limited to the UK or Australia or the US. I think we need to sort of expand the scope of public health research, and maybe even conduct studies right here in Cyprus. So I'll finish up with that and stop sharing my screen, and then I think we'll hopefully have a nice discussion about public health and gambling. So thank you.
So thank you very much again. Thank you, Eric. Being myself, I wouldn't call myself an expert, but in any case, an expert in policy. I would like to take this opportunity and use your brains as you are experts. And the thing that I would like to hear more about is what are the issues that should be taken into account when trying to implement public health approach for gambling, and how is this related to addressing other addictions? Because of course, as you have mentioned, usually gambling addiction disorder coexists with other issues. So your take on that.
Who do you want to go with first?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start off. I mean, Eric might have a different view to me. I've always said that gambling doesn't occur in a vacuum. when we look at, if we look at, for instance, the incidence and prevalence of comorbidity with gambling, we will see that, problem gamblers have a higher incidence and prevalence of alcohol problems, drug problems, risky sex, depression, anxiety. So we have to have a more coordinated approach. I'm going to say one of the things I was mentioning back in 2007 in my report for the BMA is that, gambling can be treated alongside other addiction services because these things do tend to co-occur. So we do have to have a more coordinated and joined up thinking. My perspective on gambling has always been that where you increase access and opportunity to addictive behaviours, whether that be nicotine, alcohol and gambling, where you increase access and opportunity, you tend to increase the number of people who engage in those behaviours, and as a result of that, although thankfully it's not proportional, you do tend to then see an increase in the number of problems related to those activities. So obviously from a policy perspective, you've got to think about what is the best way that we can, if you like, maximise fun in gambling but minimise harm for those who are affected by gambling. And whether it's increasing the tax burden or whether it's reducing the amount of opportunities that people have. But of course now, when I first started 35 years ago, we didn't have this thing called the internet. We didn't have smartphones. We didn't have tablets, laptops, etc. Now, of course, when we think about gambling as it is now, it's very hard to, if you like, limit the availability because anyone that's got a smartphone is walking around with a bookmakers or a casino in their back pocket. So it does mean that, when I see, for instance, in the UK, when people are trying to ban the opening of a casino or a bookmakers, to me, this, that argument is almost dead and buried now because we are now living in the online age. I look at my own 3 children, they're all screenagers. They all spend a disproportionate amount of their day and their social lives and their work lives, for that matter, online. And we've got to realise this is how people do things now. And, in 20 years' time, the majority of people will be gambling online rather than going into casinos, bookmakers, etc. So when it comes to, prevention and treatment, we do have to have this kind of holistic, integrated policy that sees gambling as part of a lifestyle cluster of behaviours, because most of these behaviours, whether it's, smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol or gambling, a lot of those people who have problems are using it as a coping strategy to deal with other problems in their life. And we can't necessarily just treat gambling on its own. We have to treat the totality of the person. So I'll throw it over to Eric now.
Thank you very much for that, Eric.
Oh, yeah. And, I think Mark makes some really good points about kind of this holistic approach, right? So not just thinking about gambling in isolation, thinking about the whole person and kind of their circumstances that they come from, and, recognizing that certain people might have particular risk factors for developing gambling-related problems, But, I think Mark makes another interesting point about technology and really how, we're in sort of an unprecedented world now, right, with smartphones and really this proliferation of mobile gambling. But, I think that also provides certain opportunities for public health approaches that, you might not have for things like alcohol or cigarettes, right? So with technology, right, comes the ability to have things like self-limiting features or self-exclusion features. And, no one would even imagine, countrywide self-exclusion from bars, for example, right, for someone with alcohol addiction. But now, with the rise in technology and things like platform-wide self-exclusion, I really think there's a lot of unique opportunities for gambling policy to sort of help regulate markets and really help to provide people with more tools that can help them to manage their gambling.
Okay,
so,
thanks
those are
for
sort of
that.
my thoughts.
So, I don't know if there are any questions. There are, yeah. Oh, so, do our speakers see those questions?
Yeah.
Or should
You
I?
can see them, yeah?
You do?
Yeah.
We do.
Okay. So, we could take the one that is addressed to Dr. Griffiths first, and then we could follow up with a comment by both of you on the other two.
Okay, I'm going to have to read this out to myself.
Sorry. I thought you...
Sorry. So I'm being asked
a question
to agree.
To Mark that says, would you agree with the statement that currently it is quite the time to educate the decision makers in order for the prejudice to be eliminated and problematic gambling becomes indeed a public health issue so that free access to health services is provided to addicted persons? So it touches upon the issue of stigma and, of course, the decision makers and policy makers.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I hope that, everything I've done over the last 35 years, it isn't just about the research we do. If I do research, there's no point doing it unless it can be applied. And of course, I want that to be applied and be used by the stakeholders. I mean, when I was going to conferences 35 years ago, the idea that we'd have gambling operators and academics in the same room it just would never have happened. Now, of course, when we go to gambling conference, we see this multi-stakeholder approach. And, it's my job as a researcher to obviously try and use my research and apply those findings so that they are used by legislators, policymakers, government officials, service providers, and other researchers. That is our job that we should be doing. So in a nutshell, of course, I believe that decision makers should be educated. And of course, they are being educated, but they are often hampered by the resources they've got at their disposal to try and enact some of the things that we want to be implemented. In terms of, do I believe that gamblers should get free treatment within a national health service? Well, we have a national health service in the UK which is free at the point of demand. The fact that alcohol and drug addicts get that treatment for free at the point of demand, I don't see why gamblers shouldn't have that as well. I know in America where you've got private health insurance systems, there is big debate about whether things like gambling and problematic video game playing should be seen as genuine health disorders because that has implications for insurance policies. But here in the UK, we have a national health system. It is, as I say, it's free for anybody that wants to use it. And gambling is just one of the many behaviours that I think should be free at the point of demand. But of course, every single healthcare trust in the UK only has a finite budget, and then they've got to make decisions about how they spend that budget. And it's probably always going to be the case that people with heart problems, cancer problems will always get money and get treated before somebody that has a gambling problem.
So thank you for that. Can we have the questions back, please? Until the questions show up, I should just say here that in Cyprus, because the question is probably from somebody here, in Cyprus, treating of addictions, including gambling, is free and provided by the state. So we have more questions yet. What do you think about sport sponsorships? Should it be banned? What does the research indicate? I will read the next one also. Since most of the problematic players do not realize or admit the issue, do you believe that the providers or even the regulators should take action directly and enforcing limitations instead of expecting from the user to take action? So these questions are addressed to both of you. So Eric, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Well, I could take on the second one. So, I think it's an interesting point that, you kind of expect people to want to take action, to recognize that they might have a gambling problem. But one of the features of, gambling disorder is going to be sort of not recognizing or not wanting to realize that you're suffering, with this kind of addiction. So, I think, absolutely operators can take action proactively, right? And we've seen this, I think, in the UK and sort of in some of the US, the really early sort of sports betting, which has recently become legalized. But the idea that if somebody's constantly exceeding spending limits, right, that might be operator induced, or if people are constantly maybe clicking on self-exclusion resources, but not signing up, right? Operators can reach out to them, potentially by email or through other means and ask the people, how's everything going, right? Sort of just a warm check-in to see what's going on. Another option might be, provisioning responsible or safer play resources, right? Which might include something like sending an email to a customer and just, providing them with a list of the safer play features that are available. So yeah, I think, absolutely operators can take action proactively. And I've even seen a few instances where operators will, right on registration, they'll send out safer play resources too, so people can get involved early on in their gambling career, at least with that particular operator. I think with land-based, it's a little bit more difficult, right? Because with land-based, essentially anyone can go in and maybe use cash for their gambling transactions. But even with that, you can do things like hand out brochures, to people, or have safer play messaging that shows up on, electronic gambling machines and so on. So
I'm just informed that we have only 2 minutes. So
yep.
Some brief remarks on your part, Mark? And
just in following what Eric just said, I mean, I'm a great believer that all gambling operators have a duty of care towards their clientele. Most of the companies that I've worked with, and I have worked with a number of online operators, is that they are very proactive, using their behavioural tracking and account-based data to actually intervene in the case of suspected cases of problem gambling. For me, the issue of responsible gambling or safer gambling isn't just about problem gambling. It's about that, everybody who uses gambling technologies and gambling products, is that we, obviously we want all of them to gamble within their means, and for it to be an affordable, and safe and fun and exciting activity to do. In relation to the other question that was asked about banning sports sponsorships, I've published countless papers over the last 10 years looking at the relationship between advertising, marketing, gambling. It's a really complex relationship. And quite interesting, here in the UK, we've seen a 600% increase in advertising and marketing, but we've had absolutely no increase in problem gambling whatsoever. What we have seen is what I would call displacement effect, in terms of, so things like in-play sports betting has really come to the fore now. We know that in-play sports betting does have a high association with problematic gambling. And this is because the basic characteristics of sports betting has changed dramatically over the last decade. 10 years ago, traditionally, you would just bet on whether a team won or lost on a particular game. Now, of course, we have 60 or 70 markets on any one particular game happening at any point. People are not just betting on the outcome; they're betting who's going to score, the number of penalties, how many throw-ins, how many red cards. There are so many different things that people can gamble, and when you've got 4 or 5 matches that are back-to-back being played, it means that sports bettors can be gambling, for a 10-hour period, whereas traditionally, 10 years ago, they would just be making one discontinuous bet, on a particular match, which, is not associated with problem gambling.
So, thank you very much. I think that despite being the last point on the agenda and everybody being tired, we were rewarded by a very interesting discussion, even you being abroad and online. So thank you very, very much for your contributions. It was very, very interesting talking to you.